Hello and welcome to our fourth Listen and Learn series, or shall I say episode, for summer 2024. And as a reminder, these episodes are super duper short and designed to support professional learning for educators and emerging scholars over the summer months.
In this Listen and Learn series, we are focused on classic literature from the field of creativity, which we hope will not only offer you a historical perspective, but also bridge some of those connections between research and teaching and learning environments.
Now, Cyndi and I have been talking about this a lot because it's still exciting news, and to us it's still extremely new because remember we produce these episodes, a few of them back to back, but we have an emerging scholar in residence in Jimmy Wilson, and he's going to be offering some commentary about some of these episodes on our website, fuelingcreativitypodcast.com.
And to make things extra fun, which we are all about the fun in the summer, at the end of each episode, we will share a single letter, which is part of a code word that you, our listeners, must put together and scramble around and try to guess before the end of August.
And we did say in the introduction episode, which has 2 letters, that you're not allowed to use AI to work this out. And once you've got these letters and identified the code word, you have to email us at questions@fuelingcreativitypodcast.com, not only with the code word, but we also would like to see some connections you've made to some of the conversations we've had around the classical literature and how that might inform what you're planning to do for the upcoming school year. And of course, if you do that, we're going to give away a prize to a winner, so long as we receive this by the end of August.
So, Matt, let's begin.
Okay, Cyndi, well, we've kind of got into this period in our classical journey through the study of creativity. As a reminder, we introduced Joy Paul Guilford in the first episode, who really kind of stood up in an inaugural speech to the American Psychological Association and said, hey, we're not doing a very good job in terms of studying this thing called creativity. And in essence, putting out there and saying, I think creativity is something different than intellect. And what we then started to see is the field beginning to emerge, people obviously having to then say, well, let's look at defining creativity, because we need to define it. We need to operationalize the construct so we can study it. So we got into Mel Rhodes, who tried to do that, wasn't necessarily successful. But what he did do is present the 4 Ps and said, hey, when we're talking about creativity, we're talking about the product, we're talking about the press, we're talking about the person, and sometimes we're talking about press, the environment. And we also got into McKinnon in our last, I think, episode 3. And that was kind of like, okay, let's go and look at some of this emerging talent. Let's not just focus on eminent creativity practitioners. Let's go and look at how we might nurture creativity in the classroom. So we're starting to see that. We're starting to look at identifying personality traits that might be particularly conducive for helping people go on and be creative later in life. And then we also covered Alex Osborne and the creative problem-solving process that had some ideation. But now I think that the following 2 articles is really beginning to focus in on the classroom environment now. We're about 20 years into the field of creativity, and it makes sense that we're starting to see some of these creativity scholars really starting to focus and say, okay, well, can we teach creativity? And if we can, how might we go about doing that? And so you're going to introduce who I'm assuming must be, well, a very special scholar to both of us, but particularly to you. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay. So today we're going to look at the work of E. Paul Torrance, who is known as the father of creativity in education. And he started his work in this field in 1958. And this article we're going to look at today, which was published in 1972, is called, Can We Teach Children to Think Creatively? So let's just position this in the rest of the timeline. So Guilford does his speech in 1950. This is 1972. Now, Torrance established the most well-known test for creativity, which is called the Torrance test of creative thinking, which was established in 1966. So this is just 6 years later, 1972. And in this paper, he summarizes the results of 133 studies that were designed to test approaches to teaching children to think creatively. Now, Matt, one of the most interesting things I thought about this article is the fact that E. Paul Torrance says right from the beginning, I know I'm going to get a lot of criticism from this paper. I know people are going to snap back and say, creativity cannot be taught. And he said, but I have seen students teach creativity. I've watched my wife teach students creativity, and I've seen many other people learn creativity, and I know it can be taught. from a qualitative perspective. But he said, we do need to start looking at studies and we need to look at the measurement. And that's one of the reasons why he established the Torrance test of creative thinking. So he looks in this paper at different modalities of how people have taught creativity with training programs, with CPS, with creative problem solving, which we will see in our final paper that we reflect on with the Creative Studies Project. We look at training in semantics and creativity research. We look at complex problems involving packages of materials like the Purdue Creativity Program. He looked at articles related to creative arts as vehicles for teaching and practicing creative teaching. He looked at curriculum, teacher classroom variables, motivation, which we see a lot of when it comes to creativity in the classroom now. And then he looked at testing conditions, which were designed to facilitate a higher level of creative functioning. Now, what I think is so interesting is there has been so much research that has emerged from those 9 areas that he outlined. But at the time of this publication, which was 1972, really the predominant place that they found the most impact in creative problem solving was training programs with creative problem solving. And as I mentioned, in the next episode, we're going to be talking about the Creative Studies Project, which was done by Sid Parnes and Ruth Noller over at Buffalo State. And they look at training in creative problem solving. So I don't want to get too deep into that. But what did really strike me, Matt, is here we have all these different modalities, and now we can honestly say that so much of this has been researched. We've looked at climate. We've looked at motivation and intrinsic motivation, rewards, things like Teresa Mobley, who we will be having coming on the show, probably season 11. We see all of these different types of programs that have emerged since the 1970s, which was obviously, it seems crazy to say this, but this was over 50 years ago. So what's exciting is that so much has been done to flourish teaching creativity and the impact of creativity training. What I really loved about this article was the vulnerability he shared in saying, I know I've seen this, but it may not all be represented through quantitative research. And Matt, I know for myself and for you as well, we have both had experiences where we've taught creativity and we see the impact of that. And I even remember myself as a young graduate student in the late 1990s when I took my first graduate course with Dr. Roger Firestein. And I was sitting in the course and I was in a very dark place in my life. I was in my early 20s. I'd just come off a national Broadway tour. And I said, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And I really felt like the possibilities of the world were sort of limited. I didn't really think that I had the capacity to do that much. I had very little hope in terms of what my future looked like, because what I originally had planned as being an actor was no longer something I wanted to do. And I remember the first night I came home in learning creative problem solving with Roger, and I started brainstorming different things that I could do with my life. And I was really trying to live the principle of delaying judgment, which we talked about in that last article with McKinnon. I was really trying to delay my judgment. And by the time I woke up in the morning on the second day of class, my entire bedroom was covered with Post-its of all the things that I could do with my life. And what it really taught me is how to create possibilities, to go beyond my limitations and to imagine things that don't exist. And that's sort of how I've lived my entire life after that moment in time, in terms of what I believe creativity really brings to the table is this idea of possibilities and hope for the future and a better future and improving on things. And so that really struck me. And I remember going to Roger on the second day of class and I said, I not only have one thing I want to do with my life, I have at least 200. And he just laughed at me and he's like, yep. And he still talks about that day where I shared with him this. And we didn't have phones at the time because it was, like I said, the late 1990s, but where I shared with him all of these Post-its that I had across my entire bedroom. So can you think of a time that you really felt like you learned about creativity and the impact it had on you, or learned creatively, or that someone taught you how to be more creative?
Yeah, I actually can. And I think it's related within these creative thinking skills. And if you think about, just to kind of back down to the article a little bit, this is about identifying, in essence, whether you want to call them actions, strategies, ways of thinking that are conducive for creativity. And so you're referencing in that story this idea that we can focus on quantity over quality and reserve judgment. And what that does is obviously it produces a massive amount of ideas. And we can teach that. We can promote that in our classroom. And that piece of your story relates to how I kind of discovered creativity. And it was actually, in some ways, I think, in terms of my generation and people who've probably been teaching for the last 15 to 20 years, Ken Robinson's connected to it. But before I do that, I'll quickly premise the story. And it is a funny story. And I appreciate the fact you've given me an opportunity to share it. And I used to share it. In fact, about 4 or 5 years, my main conference presentation was around creativity and problem-based learning. And I infused the Torrance incubation model of teaching and learning, which I learned at Buff State with yourself and Cyndi and Matthew, actually, her class. And I integrated it into my project-based learning environment, both in the high school programs and then when I transitioned to university. And I'm going off on a little bit of tangent, but I wanted to do a shout out to Dr. Keller Mathers, who has been a guest on our show. And before I met Susan Keller Mathers, I kind of stumbled along this problem. So here it is. I am about 18 months into working with about 10 to 12 high schools in Connecticut. And we are doing a project-based learning environment at these schools. And I've been tasked with implementing a new digital media and movie making program, which went on to establish the Connecticut Student Film Festival and the 84-Hour Film Challenge and a whole bunch of different activities centered around digital media and movie making. And one of the first activities was to produce a PSA, a public service announcement, 1 minute, that had to center around the green theme. Okay, that was it. Green was the theme for that year. And we had I think we brought all of the schools to this single event, and it was kind of like a new program. All of the funders were there, and everyone was excited to see the first draft of these public service announcements. And this was the first project. At the end of the year, they had to produce a documentary film. And we had an online curriculum that they were following. And there was a lot of kind of excitement in the air because it's this new program. Connecticut's just introduced all these film and digital media tax credits. So it's kind of connected to this talent pipeline. And I'm starting to feel a little bit nervous because I suddenly realized, wow, there's could be a little bit of judgment on me. And, I sit in the front row and we've got all of these different funders here and members of the state here. And I remember going up and setting up the laptop and creating a playlist of all of the films. And I remember the first film was like, wow, this is impressive. It was reasonably good. I said, yes. The only concern I had with it was the fact that it was on recycling. And I was like, okay, but I didn't necessarily feel like it was a very creative story to share. So anyway, the second film came on and it was like, they were kind of like, there was some sound issues. The quality wasn't as good. So it kind of like took the mood down a little bit. But what really was challenging was the fact that the story was, again, on recycling. So I was like, how much bad luck did I have to play these two films from two different schools back to back, and it was on recycling. So then what's funny is I looked around the room and School A was looking at School B, giving it, I can't believe they did our theme. I can't believe it, that we did it recycling. And I was looking around, I was like, yeah, it's pretty bad luck, So anyway, the third film came up and it was okay. But of course, the theme was recycling. And I think 9 films were shown that day. And I think 7 of them was on recycling. And I said to myself, hold on, did I say the PSA should be on recycling, And I looked in the material, I said, no, the assignment wasn't on recycling. And I think the issue that I had at the time, I think, going back, I think I've always valued originality and the new ideas. And I think you've worked with me. I'm always craving to do new and different things. So to me, dare I say it, recycling was boring and it didn't offer anything new. There was no information. Everyone knows they're meant to recycle. Why we don't recycle, that could be an interesting problem to explore. But just telling us that we're going to recycle and, we can put a can in a trash can, a special trash can. I was like, this is terrible. So cut long story short, my boss looked at me, who's actually Michael Mino, who we've had on the show. And he said, Matt, no one was disappointed because the quality of the films weren't too bad. But it was like, Matt, we better make sure that we don't end up with a bunch of documentary films about recycling. So I had to go and do an intervention with the schools. And I went to one school and we had a little bit of a conversation. I didn't get enough from that conversation to really work out what the problem was. In essence, I said, try and do something different than recycling them. Then I went to the second school, and one of the teachers said to me, I said, it was a very positive conversation, but they said this interesting thing to me. They said, I think one of the challenges for the project is the theme. I said, oh, okay, why is that? They said, well, it's green. It feels very restrictive. And I went, wait, green's a color. Like, what do you mean it's restrictive, right? And I suddenly realized that they connect green with recycling, and that was all they had. That was the only connection they made. And I suddenly went away and I said to myself, the problem is actually just that people don't know how to be original. Now, I didn't have the word creativity at that point, but around the same time, because this was 2007, around the same time, someone shared me Ken Robinson's TED video, the 2006 TED Talk. And suddenly I made the connection that originality is associated with creativity. And I was like, that's the problem. And I suddenly realized that's what I was passionate about. That was something that I enjoy doing, is always being original. And I suppose in some ways, maybe it was things like the likes of Alex Osborne noticed that they like to go and find original ways to generate ideas. And so I said to myself, okay, like this is something that I've got to do an intervention. How do we teach students to be more original?
Yeah.
So cut a long story short, I did some Googling. I was looking for a graduate program at the time. And that actually, Cyndi, within a few months, I called you, spoke to you on the phone, and then I enrolled in some classes at Buff State while I was doing a master's at Central Connecticut State University. And that opened up my eyes, of course, not only to the field of creativity, but to your point, scholars like E. Paul Torrance that have identified the fluency principle and the ability to be original, and then provided strategies on how to do that. And I would say I spent the next 3 to 5 years after that focusing primarily on trying to get kids to think more original and to try and apply the fluency principle. And even when I transitioned to the University of Connecticut, that was one of my number one goals. And so you were talking a little bit about how I interpreted it is going in with the goal to try and teach creativity in the classroom. And I think it's definitely complex, and there's environmental factors that come in. And I don't know if a single strategy can always be the answer. But what I would say is through modifying and tweaking, I believe, and I've done this for 10 years now, that my project-based learning class, my digital media 101 class, where they have to identify a problem and then come up with an original solution to that problem, I believe I've developed a formula where for the most part, every single year for the last 10 years, very rarely do we get the same ideas. We get some similar themes and we talk about that. Bullying, for example, popular theme a few years ago. Anxiety, depression, popular theme a few years ago, over the last couple of years. But for the most part, I've had like know your rights when you get pulled over. I've had like how to back up your hard drive. I mean, we're going back 10 years now, but just all these original ideas. And I believe it's come about because of the work, me basically modifying, tweaking, and applying the work of E. Paul Torrance in the classroom. And I know, right, that I have also observed increased creativity from the perspective of getting more original ideas out in the classroom through these strategies.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing that story. I love it. And I didn't know that story. So thank you for sharing. So to wrap up this article on E. Paul Torrance, again, known as the father of creativity in education, has done over 1,800 journals, articles, books, and all sorts of things to add to the field. And so much, as you know, Matt, so much of the work that he did, I built upon because my mentor, Dr. Mary Murdoch, was a student of his. So I know a lot about Torrance and feel blessed that I am sort of a grandchild of Torrance, E. Paul Torrance. And
hold on, Cyndi. I want to jump out just in case you're uncomfortable plugging it. And of course, if you're interested in this work centered around creative thinking, any of Cyndi's books, the most recent one around higher education and infusing creative thinking, to your point, it provides the context to Torrance's work and then how you've built upon it. So Just wanted to throw that out there. Sorry to interrupt.
Thanks so much. And I just want to close out with, if you see this monkey in my background, this was one of Torrance's original monkeys that he used in the test of creative thinking. So I keep this. And it's funny because when we did the Torrance Festival of Ideas, someone had another version of this monkey, a later version of the monkey, which he used in the Torrance test of creative thinking. He didn't ask the monkey to generate ideas. It was, what were all the things you could do with the monkey? So make sure you check out the work of E. Paul Torrance if you're interested in the classic literature. We will be revisiting him in the winter months as we get into a Listen Learn series next winter that focuses on the 80s and 90s of creativity. Until then, we have one more episode for you. And Matt, we can't forget to give them the special letter for today. So are you ready? You can give the letter.
Okay, sounds good.
Here is the drum roll.
The letter is R for Romeo.
Red.
Ridicule.
Ridiculous.
Romantic.
Rest.
Required.
Rolling.
Okay, well, we're going to end the rolling of this episode here. So let's cut there and rolling. My name's Dr. Matthew Worwood.
And my name is Dr. Cyndi Burnett. This episode was produced by Matthew Worwood and Cyndi Burnett. Our podcast sponsor is Curiosity to Create, and our editor is Sam Atkinson.